There is a bottle in the collection of the American Museum of Natural History that still sets off a Geiger counter. It is a small brown glass bottle with a cork stopper and a paper label. The label reads, Radithor, certified radioactive water. The bottle is approximately 80 years old. The radium inside it has a half-life of 1,600 years. It will be setting off that counter long after every person currently alive is dead. The bottle was manufactured by the Bailey Radium Laboratories of East Orange, New Jersey, between 1918 and 1931. During those 13 years, the company produced somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 bottles. The price was $1 per bottle, which at the time was the equivalent of roughly an hour's wage for a factory worker. The product was marketed as a cure for arthritis, hypertension, stomach disorders, impotence, lethargy, quote, one, and, in at least one documented advertising circular, as a general tonic suitable for maintaining vigorous health in men and women of all ages. The founder of Bailey Radium Laboratories held a degree from a diploma mill in Connecticut. He had previously served federal prison time for mail fraud related to a different medical product. He was not operating in a regulatory vacuum, he was operating in a regulatory system that had not yet decided whether what he was doing was illegal, and he moved quickly enough that by the time it decided, he had made his money. This is not a story about ignorance. The science was not primitive. The warnings were not absent. Radium's capacity to damage living tissue had been documented, published, and discussed in scientific journals since 1903. The men who built the radium product industry had read the literature. They understood what they were selling. They sold it anyway. For 30 years. Before any of that, before the lawyers and the courtrooms and the jawbones crumbling in physicians' hands, there was a discovery that genuinely changed the world, made by a woman who genuinely did not know what it was doing to her. Marie Curie and her husband Pierre discovered radium in 1898. The element is naturally occurring, a decay product of uranium, and extraordinarily rare. To isolate 1 gram of radium, the Curies processed roughly 10 tons of pitchblende ore over a 4-year period in a leaking shed with no ventilation, no protective equipment, and no understanding of the mechanism by which the material was affecting their bodies. Marie Curie noted in her laboratory journal that the radioactive samples glowed faintly in the dark. She found this beautiful. Pierre Curie, in a separate set of notes, had already observed that radioactive material applied to skin produced a wound that healed slowly and left a permanent mark. He had documented this in detail. He published it. He described exactly the mechanism: ionizing radiation penetrating tissue, damaging cells at the molecular level, producing effects that did not resolve the way a burn or a cut resolved. That paper was available in 1903. Every scientist working in the field of radioactivity read it or read citations of it. This is the foundation of everything that follows. When the first radium health products appeared on the market in 1904 and 1905, the documented evidence of radium's tissue-damaging capacity was already in the scientific literature. Not hidden, not obscure, published, peer-reviewed, and cited. Marie Curie herself died of aplastic anemia in 1934, a condition caused by decades of radiation exposure. Her laboratory notebooks from the 1890s are still radioactive. They are stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Researchers who want to examine them must sign a liability waiver. The notebooks will remain radioactive for approximately 1,500 more years. Curie did not know what the material was doing to her. The people who came after her, who read her papers, and Pierre's papers, and the papers that followed, had less excuse for that particular ignorance. The first wave of radium consumer products appeared in France and Germany, where the element had been isolated and spread quickly to Britain and the United States. The reasoning was a version of the same logic applied to every powerful substance in that era. If radium does things, if it produces effects at the cellular level, then those effects might be therapeutic. The logic was not entirely irrational. X-rays, discovered in 1895, had already shown that radiation could treat certain tumors. The jump from quote 2 to quote 3 was scientifically unjustified, but it was made, and it was made in public, in medical journals, in newspapers, in product catalogues, and in advertisements that reached millions of people. By 1910, the radium health product industry had segmented itself into several distinct categories. Radium water was the entry-level product, water that had been filtered through radioactive ore and therefore contained measurable, if small, levels of radium. Radithor, manufactured by Bailey, was a step up, a sealed glass ampule of distilled water with a guaranteed minimum radioactive content expressed in micro-Curies. There were radium pads, devices you wore against the skin, resembling heating pads, designed to deliver a gentle and continuous dose. Radium bread, sold primarily in Germany, used flour that had been stored in containers lined with radioactive material. Radium face creams promised to restore youthful appearance through the gentle, stimulating action of radioactivity on skin cells. Radium toothpaste, marketed under the brand name Dora Mad in Germany, available until 1945, promised whiter teeth and healthier gums. They were radium suppositories. They were radium contraceptive devices. There was, briefly, a radium-lined device marketed for the treatment of impotence, which the catalogue described as delivering a vitalizing atomic energy directly to the relevant structures. The marketing language across all of these products drew on the same vocabulary. Radium was described as the life force element. It was the substance that animated living cells. It was what the sun gave off in its warming rays, bottled for daily use. The advertisements were not selling radioactive material, they were selling the hidden energy of nature, harnessed by modern science, made available to ordinary people for the first time. Some of the advertising copy was extraordinary in its precision of implication, without making any claim that could be cleanly falsified. Quote 4, quote 5. The word quote 6, quote was doing significant work in that sentence. Nobody asked who had measured the benefit, against what standard, using what methodology. Several actual physicians promoted these products. Some were paid. Some genuinely believed, based on their reading of the contested scientific literature, that low-dose radiation might be therapeutic. Some had simply observed that patients who took radium tonics reported feeling better and did not investigate why. The answer, when researchers later looked at it, was a combination of placebo effect, the general stimulant quality of mild radiation exposure in the very short term, and the fact that many patients had consulted doctors about vague complaints that had no specific organic cause, and the tonics gave them something concrete to do about their problem. You feel better because you believe you will feel better. You die later, slowly, from the inside. The timeline is long enough that the connection was easy to miss, if you were inclined to miss it. This was not a fringe market. These products were reviewed in mainstream newspapers, advertised in respectable magazines, and recommended by physicians who had read the same scientific literature that documented radium's hazards and reached a different conclusion about what the dosage levels in consumer products actually meant. A genuine argument existed about threshold effects, whether low-level radiation exposure was harmful, neutral, or possibly beneficial. The argument was eventually settled, and it was settled conclusively in favor of harmful at any dose, but in 1910 or 1915 there was enough scientific disagreement that a company marketing radium products could cite legitimate researchers in their promotional materials. They did. They also, in some cases, had internal data suggesting harm. They cited the former and suppressed the latter. This is the distinction that matters. The dial painting industry came out of World War I. Radium had an obvious military application: watches and instrument panels that glowed in the dark. A soldier in a trench needed to read his watch without striking a match. An aviator needed to read his altimeter in darkness. Luminous dials made from radium paint, radium mixed with zinc sulfide, which glowed when struck by the radiation, were a genuine military necessity from roughly 1916 onward, and after the war ended, they became a civilian product. Luminous watches were fashionable, expensive, and widely desired. The United States Radium Corporation, headquartered in Orange, New Jersey, employed several hundred young women to paint the dials. The work paid well by the standards of the time, and the alternatives: better than factory sewing, better than domestic service, better than most jobs available to women without professional training in industrial New Jersey in 1917. The women sat at long tables, each with a small dish of radium paint and a fine-tipped brush, and they painted numbers onto watch dials at piecework rates. A skilled painter could produce hundreds of dials per day. The work required precision and patience and was considered skilled labor. The women who did it were proud of their ability to do it well. Some of them were among the most productive workers in the region. They earned more than their brothers, in some cases. They brought home wages that supported families. The job was considered desirable. The paint had a name the workers used among themselves: Undark. It was the commercial name the company used in its advertising as well. It glowed. In the dark workrooms, the women's hands glowed. Their faces glowed when they brought the brush close to examine their work. Some of them, going home in the evenings, found their clothing emitting a faint luminescence. They thought this was charming. They told their families about it. Their families thought it was charming too. One worker described arriving home from her shift to show her young sisters her glowing hands. The sisters were delighted. Nobody in that household knew what they were looking at. The brush had to be brought to a very fine point to produce the clean lines the dial required. The standard technique, taught to every new employee, was to bring the brush to the lips. Lip, dip, paint. The tip of the brush against the tongue, then into the paint, then onto the dial. Lip, dip, paint. A skilled worker did this hundreds of times per day. The supervisors demonstrated the technique. The trainers taught the technique. The technique was the technique. The women painted their nails with the leftover radium. They painted their hair. They painted their faces to glow at dances. The radium paint glowed green-white in the dark and was understood to be harmless, understood specifically because their employers had told them it was harmless, because there were no warnings posted in the workroom, because no protective equipment was provided or suggested, and because the men who managed the factory wore lead aprons and used lead-lined tweezers to handle the very same material. The women were not supposed to notice this distinction. Several of them did. Molly Maggier was one of the first dial painters to become sick. She developed pain in her jaw in 1921. Her teeth became loose. A dentist extracted several of them. The jaw did not heal. The extraction sites remained open wounds. She went back to the dentist. He extracted more teeth. Her jawbone began to crumble. Her dentist, at one point, while manipulating her jaw during an examination, had a portion of the bone come away in his hand. Molly Maggier died in September 1922 at the age of 24. The cause of death was recorded as syphilis. This was not an accidental misdiagnosis. The United States Radium Corporation had arranged for the death certificates of sick and dying workers to record syphilis as the cause. Syphilis carried social stigma. Syphilis could not be attributed to the factory. Syphilis was not the company's legal problem. Grace Fryer developed similar symptoms in 1922. She went to multiple doctors who found nothing explainable. Her spine was deteriorating. Her jaw was deteriorating. She spent 2 years trying to find a physician who could identify what was happening to her, and 2 more years trying to find an attorney who would take the case. The attorneys she approached told her that the evidence was insufficient. The company was well defended, and the statute of limitations on workplace injury claims in New Jersey was 2 years from the date of exposure, which meant that workers who had been employed in 1917 and 1918, when the lip-dipping technique was taught, were already time-barred by the time their bodies showed symptoms. Grace Fryer found a lawyer named Raymond Berry. He took the case without a retainer. Berry assembled 4 other plaintiffs, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice, each with documented medical histories showing the same pattern of bone deterioration, jaw disintegration, and systemic failure. The United States Radium Corporation had known since at least 1924 that radium was accumulating in the bones of its workers. The company's own medical consultant, a physician named Frederick Flynn, had examined sick workers, found evidence of radium deposition in their bones, and filed reports that were not shared with the workers or their physicians. A Harvard researcher named Cecil Drinker had conducted an independent workplace study in 1924 at the company's invitation, found evidence of radioactive contamination throughout the facility and in the bodies of workers, and submitted his findings to the company. The company revised his report before it was published under Drinker's name. Drinker, who became aware of the revision, was furious. His protests were ignored. The altered report was published. The original findings, which showed the contamination clearly, did not appear in print until a decade later. The lawsuit was filed in 1927. The company deployed every legal resource available to it. It hired the best medical experts money could find to argue that the workers' conditions were attributable to other causes. It attempted to have the case dismissed on statute of limitations grounds, the same argument the first attorneys had raised. It challenged the scientific basis of the connection between radium and the workers' symptoms. It attempted to delay the proceedings long enough that the plaintiffs would die before a verdict was reached. Several plaintiffs were in deteriorating health. The company's calculation was straightforward. Dead plaintiffs cannot testify. The men running the United States Radium Corporation were not anonymous. They were Arthur Roeder, the company president, and his successor executives, men who had personal knowledge of the Drinker report, personal knowledge of Frederick Flynn's medical findings, personal knowledge of the death certificate falsifications, and who had made, each of them, specific decisions about what to do with that knowledge. The decisions they made were to suppress the research, to challenge the workers' claims, to prolong the litigation, and to attribute the deaths to syphilis. These were not institutional decisions that happened in the absence of any specific human choice. They were choices made by people with names. The names appear in the court record. The names do not appear in most accounts of the Radium Girls because the story, as it is usually told, is about the women who died, not the men who decided. A federal judge named William Clark declined to dismiss the case. In the summer of 1928, with one plaintiff too ill to leave her bed and the others visibly deteriorating, Clark allowed the plaintiffs to give their depositions immediately, rather than waiting for a trial date. The depositions became a public spectacle. Newspapers covered them. Photographs of the 5 women, Grace Fryer and the others, some requiring stretchers, some with visible jaw deformities, one transported in a specially constructed chair because she could no longer sit upright, appeared on front pages across the country. They became known as the Radium Girls. The United States Radium Corporation, facing a public relations collapse, settled. The terms included back medical expenses, annual payments for each plaintiff, and lump sums. The amounts were not large. The settlement also included no admission of liability. The company stated clearly, and for the record, that it did not accept that its workplace practices had caused the workers' conditions. The workers accepted the settlement because they were dying and needed the money, and were not going to outlive a trial. None of the original 5 plaintiffs lived long afterward. Their bones, when examined by medical researchers in the following years, were measurably radioactive. Their skeletons, when exhumed for study in later decades, still registered on Geiger counters. Radium deposits in bone do not clear. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. Some of those women are buried in New Jersey. Their bones are still radioactive today. The radium tonic industry might have continued considerably longer without Eben Byers. Byers was a socialite, an amateur golf champion, and a man of substantial personal wealth and social prominence who had been taking Radithor, guaranteed radioactive water, from the Bailey Radium Laboratories since 1927. He had been recommended it by his physician for a persistent arm injury sustained in a fall. He found it effective. He found it so effective that he consumed approximately 1,300 bottles of Radithor over the following 4 years. He became an enthusiast and a promoter. He wrote letters to William Bailey praising the product. Those letters were used in advertising materials. By 1931, Byers had lost approximately 40 pounds. His skull bones were visibly deteriorating. His jaw had largely dissolved. Holes had opened in his skull. A Wall Street Journal reporter visited him at his home, was shown into a room where Byers lay in a hospital bed, and wrote an account of what he saw that was published under the headline __, quote _, 8 __. The headline is perhaps the most efficient summary of the consumer radium industry's endgame. The Federal Trade Commission had been investigating radioactive patent medicines since 1929. The Wall Street Journal story and the public attention that followed Byers's death in April 1932 accelerated the process. The FTC issued findings that Radithor's therapeutic claims were unsupported by evidence. The American Medical Association, which had been cautiously observing the radium product industry for years, issued a definitive statement that radium-based health products had no demonstrated therapeutic value and documented evidence of serious harm. The industry collapsed within a year of Byers's death. William Bailey of Bailey Radium Laboratories died in 1949, ironically of cancer. His bones were found, on posthumous examination, to be heavily radioactive. The dial painting cases continued through the 1930s. A second group of workers at a facility in Ottawa, Illinois, filed suit after the New Jersey settlement. Their cases were contested even more aggressively. The Radium Dial Company, a separate operation from United States Radium Corporation, but using identical methods, identical paint, and the identical lip-dip paint technique, had been fully aware of the New Jersey cases from 1927 onward. The publicity was national. The newspapers had covered the depositions extensively. The company's management had read the coverage. They made a decision. The decision was not to change the technique, not to issue protective equipment, not to stop the lip pointing. The decision was to continue because the orders were there, the contracts were there, and the New Jersey settlement had not included a court finding of liability that would have set a legal precedent binding on them. The Ottawa workers became sick in the same sequence, for the same reasons, on the same timeline as the New Jersey workers. Their jawbones deteriorated, their spines compressed, their teeth fell out. The symptoms were identical to what had been documented, published, extensively reported in newspapers, and litigated in New Jersey. The company disputed the connection. The company's medical consultants argued, again, that alternative causes were possible. The litigation was slow, expensive, and contested at every procedural step. Catherine Wolfe Donoghue, who had worked at the Ottawa facility from 1922 onward, became the public face of the Illinois cases in the same way Grace Fryer had in New Jersey. She was articulate, precise in describing her symptoms, and visibly ill in ways that made her testimony difficult to dispute in emotional terms, even when it was disputed in legal ones. She had kept records. She had retained documents. She understood, by the time the Illinois litigation began, exactly what had happened to her and why. She was not uncertain about the cause. She was angry. She gave her testimony from a stretcher, transported to the hearing room because she could not walk, because her bones had been destroyed by the same substance she had been told was harmless, in the same workroom where the supervisors wore lead aprons while telling her so. She died in July 1938, 5 weeks after her settlement was finalized. She was 35 years old. The last plaintiff to settle was Catherine Wolfe Donoghue, who died 5 weeks after her settlement was reached, in July 1938. She had been working at the Radium Dial Company, which had been fully aware of the New Jersey cases and had made no changes to its operating practices. Lip, dip, paint. The technique remained the technique. There is a detail in the New Jersey case that the historical summaries tend to include but rarely slow down to examine. The supervisors at the United States Radium Corporation wore lead aprons. They used lead-lined tweezers to handle the radium paint. This was standard practice in the facility for the people who managed the process. The protection was not secret. The women working the dials could see the supervisors wearing the aprons. When some of the workers asked why the supervisors wore protective equipment, they were told it was not necessary for their work, that the quantities they were handling were too small to be concerning, that it was fine. They were told this by people who were wearing lead aprons while telling them it was fine. The women believed what they were told. They had no particular reason not to. They had not read Cecil Drinker's original report. They had not been told that there was an original report. They had not been told that it had been altered before publication. They had not been told that the company's own medical consultant had found evidence of radium in their bones and written reports that were filed and not shared. They had been told the paint was harmless. They had been shown the technique. They had been told to use the technique. They used the technique. The very substance they believed would grant them immortality had slowly destroyed them from the inside. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment before the next one. The radium industry's defense, through 3 decades of litigation and public investigation, returned repeatedly to the same argument. The science was uncertain, the dosage levels were low, the connection between the products and the harm had not been conclusively established to a legal standard. This argument was not entirely fabricated. Genuine scientific uncertainty existed about dosage thresholds. But the people making the argument were the same people who had suppressed internal medical reports, falsified death certificates, and altered independent research findings before publication. The uncertainty they were citing had been carefully cultivated. When the evidence threatened to resolve the uncertainty, they ensured the evidence did not reach the people who needed it. This is the distinction the false premise erases. The common story is, people in the past were naive about radium. Scientists didn't know yet. It was a different time. This version is comfortable because it makes the harm into a tragedy with no author. The actual record shows authors. Specific people made specific decisions to sell a product they had documented evidence was causing harm. To employ workers they had documented evidence were being poisoned, and to defend those decisions in court for as long as the workers were alive enough to be defended against. What the record shows, specifically, the United States Radium Corporation had internal medical data suggesting bone abnormalities in workers by 1924. The Drinker report, as originally written, showed contamination across the facility. Frederick Flynn examined sick workers, found evidence of radium deposition, and filed reports that went into a company file and did not come out of that file until a court ordered them produced in discovery. The death certificates were altered before the bodies were cold. The statute of limitations defense was not a legal technicality stumbled upon by lawyers, it was a strategy. It was a strategy because the company knew that workers who had been exposed in 1917 and 1918 would show symptoms years later, and years later the clock would have run. The timeline between exposure and symptom was a weapon the company used deliberately because the company knew the timeline. It knew the timeline because it had the data. It had the data because it had run the tests. It ran the tests, and then it ran the clock. The legal consequences for those specific people were minimal. William Bailey died having faced no criminal charges. The executives of the United States Radium Corporation faced no criminal charges. The physician who falsified death certificates to read syphilis, a man whose name appears in the historical record and who was aware that he was attributing deaths to a disease the deceased did not have, faced no criminal charges. The regulatory framework that would have made any of those actions criminal did not yet exist, which is one of the reasons it subsequently came to exist. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which established the legal requirement that pharmaceutical products demonstrate safety before sale, which created the enforcement mechanism that has governed American drug regulation ever since, was passed the same year Catherine Donahue died in Ottawa, Illinois. The legislation had been drafted and introduced and stalled and revised and stalled again for 5 years. The specific event that broke the congressional impasse was a different pharmaceutical disaster, sulfanilamide elixir, which killed over 100 people in 1937. But the evidentiary record that informed the 1938 Act, the detailed documentation of what an unregulated pharmaceutical market actually produces, was built substantially on what had happened to the dial painters and the Radithor customers, and the thousands of people who had consumed radioactive health products over the preceding 30 years. The women who had been told the paint was safe, who had been instructed to put it in their mouths hundreds of times per day, whose bones were disintegrating while their employers revised the research findings. Those women are in the legislative history of every drug approval process that has happened in the United States since 1938. They are not usually cited. They are in it anyway. Frances Perkins, by 1938, 4 years into her tenure as Secretary of Labor, understood the connection clearly. The people who built the regulatory architecture of mid-20th century American worker and consumer protection were not responding to abstract policy problems. They were responding to specific, documented events in which specific people died because the law had not required anyone to prevent their deaths. Triangle shirtwaist, radium dial, a door that was locked, a brush that was put in the mouth, a system that, when left to optimize itself, optimized for the profit of the people at the top and externalized the cost onto the bodies of the people at the bottom. The 1938 Act required companies to prove a product safe before selling it. It reversed the burden of proof. Before 1938, a product could be sold until someone proved it harmful. After 1938, it had to be shown harmless first. That shift sounds procedural. It is not procedural. It is the difference between a legal system that treats harm as a problem to be litigated after it happens and a legal system that treats harm as a problem to be prevented before it can. The shift happened because of specific people dying in specific ways. The people who died were mostly poor. They were mostly women. They were mostly immigrants or the daughters of immigrants. They did not have the legal resources to fight the companies that employed them, and they nearly lost anyway. The law changed because enough of them survived long enough to testify, and because their testimonies were public. and because a public that had been sold radium tonics for 30 years had its own reasons to be angry about what the companies had known. The bones in New Jersey are still radioactive. They will be radioactive in 100 years. They will be radioactive when everyone now reading this account and everyone who will read it afterward is gone. The brown glass bottle in the museum collection still sets off the counter. It is 90 years old. The label is yellowed. The cork is dried. Inside, the distilled water that William Bailey guaranteed was healthy, was vitalizing, was certified radioactive, is still doing exactly what radium does. Ionizing, radiating, not stopping. It does not need a body to act on. It will simply continue, as radium does, for 1600 years, until half of it has decayed into lead. And then, in another 1600 years, the remainder, and so on. Patient, indifferent, precise. The previous video was about a building where the doors were locked so workers couldn't leave during a fire. This video has been about workers who were told the thing that was poisoning them was good for them. The next video is about 5 people who saw what was happening in different industries at different times and tried to stop it. Each of them was correct about what they saw. Each of them was professionally destroyed before anyone acted on what they found. That story is next.